Do you know what it really took to become a master craftsman back in the 1300s? Were you ready to give up your freedom, your money, and maybe even your fingers? Get ready, because we are diving deep into the medieval world around the 14th century to uncover the gnarly truths of guild life. Number 1. The cutthroat world of master competition. Imagine the year 1350, you've finally done it. You have navigated the treacherous waters of apprenticeship and the demanding journey of a journeyman. Your masterpiece, a work of art and skill, has been judged and approved by the masters of the guild. You paid your fees, you held your celebratory feast, and now you are a master. The world should be your oyster, right? Think again. Becoming a master was not the finish line. It was merely the starting gun for an entirely new, incredibly fierce race. The medieval guild system, while appearing to be a bastion of order and quality, was also a hotbed of intense competition and ruthless protectionism among its own members. Once you earned the esteemed title of master, you gained the right to open your own workshop, train apprentices, and sell your goods directly to the public. This sounds like sweet freedom after years of servitude, but the reality was far more complicated. You were no longer just competing for the favor of a master. You were now directly vying with dozens, sometimes hundreds of other masters within your very own guild for customers' commissions, and ultimately, survival. The market for many crafts, even in thriving medieval towns, was finite. If too many shoemakers, bakers, or goldsmiths were producing goods, the pie of available business simply got sliced thinner and thinner, leaving many masters with meager portions. Guilds, in theory, regulated the number of masters to prevent oversaturation. They had strict ordinances that dictated how many apprentices a master could take on, and often how many journeymen they could employ. For instance, the London Weavers' Guild, known for its powerful grip on the textile trade, had ordinances stating that no master was allowed to keep more than 2 apprentices at a time, and a master could not take on a new apprentice until the previous one had completed at least 7 years of his term. This was a deliberate attempt to control the flow of new masters into the market. However, even with these regulations, the number of qualified masters could still outstrip demand, particularly in times of economic downturn or plague, which were sadly common occurrences in the medieval era. Consider the baker. A new master baker, fresh from his masterpiece of a perfectly risen, golden-crusted sourdough loaf, would need to secure a good location for his shop. Prime spots near the market square or main thoroughfares were already occupied by established masters, many of whom had been there for decades, building up loyal customer bases and a solid reputation. Setting up shop in a less desirable area meant fewer customers, lower prices, and a constant struggle to make ends meet. Even if you found a good spot, you then had to contend with your neighbors. Master bakers were known to complain bitterly to the guild about rivals who allegedly sold underweight loaves, used inferior flour, or somehow circumvented the guild's strict price controls, all in an attempt to snatch away customers. The records of many medieval town courts and guild halls are filled with such accusations and counter-accusations, testifying to the constant friction between masters. Trade secrets were another massive point of contention, and a source of intense competition. While guilds were designed to preserve and pass down craft knowledge, they also guarded it fiercely from outsiders. However, within the guild, individual masters often possessed their own unique techniques, recipes, or finishing touches that gave them an edge. A master dyer might have a secret combination of mordants that produced a particularly vibrant red, or a master tanner a special treatment that made leather exceptionally supple. These secrets were usually passed down only to a trusted apprentice, often a son or a relative, or sometimes guarded until death. If a rival master somehow discovered or reverse-engineered these techniques, it could spell financial ruin for the original innovator. Accusations of industrial espionage while not using that modern term, were very real. Masters might send their apprentices or even hire spies to observe a competitor's workshop, trying to discern their methods. The fear of having one's unique selling propositions stolen was a constant worry. Reputation was everything in the medieval marketplace, and masters would go to extraordinary lengths to protect their own, while often attempting to, subtly or not so subtly, undermine their rivals. A master's name was synonymous with the quality of his goods. If a customer was dissatisfied with a belt made by Master Thomas, they would remember that and tell their neighbors. Conversely, if Master John's shoes were renowned for their comfort and durability, his business would flourish. Masters would engage in word-of-mouth campaigns, praising their own superior craftsmanship while subtly hinting at the supposed failings of others. This wasn't outright slander usually, but a more insidious form of reputational warfare. Guild ordinances often prohibited direct defamation among members, but enforcement was difficult, and the whispers would fly. The drive for status and influence within the guild itself also fueled fierce competition. Being a master wasn't just about making money. It was about holding a position of respect and authority in the community. Masters served on guild councils, acted as wardens, oversaw quality control, and represented the guild in town affairs. These positions carried prestige, offered opportunities for further networking, and sometimes even involved a stipend or privileged access to resources. Aspiring to these roles meant competing with other masters who also desired them, often through political maneuvering, forming alliances, and demonstrating unwavering loyalty to the guild's established hierarchy. An ambitious new master might find himself navigating a complex web of existing loyalties and grudges among the older, more entrenched masters. Furthermore, the very rules designed to protect masters also created intense internal pressure. Guilds often had strict regulations on pricing to prevent cutthroat price wars that could devalue the craft. For instance, the London Goldsmiths Guild had very specific rules about the purity of gold and silver and the price at which finished items could be sold. This was meant to ensure fair competition, but it also meant that masters could not simply lower their prices to attract more customers if their business was slow. Instead, they had to compete on quality, speed, or unique design, making the fight for commissions even more demanding. If a master was caught undercutting the fixed prices, the penalties could be severe, ranging from hefty fines to the confiscation of their goods or even expulsion from the guild, which effectively ended their career. This meant masters were always watching each other, not just for quality, but also for any infraction of the rules that could give someone an unfair advantage. Finally, the master's struggle was not just against other masters. It was also against the constant threat of economic downturns, changes in fashion, and even technological innovation, however slow it might have been in the medieval period. A master tailor might find that a new style of doublet was suddenly in vogue, requiring him to quickly adapt his skills and patterns, or risk losing customers to a more nimble competitor. A master illuminator might see his business wane as paper became more available and less ornate forms of writing became popular for certain documents, forcing him to specialize in high-end commissions or find alternative work. Competitive landscape for a medieval master was a constant battle, demanding not only exceptional skill, but also keen business acumen, political savvy, and an unwavering commitment to defending one's position in the unforgiving medieval economy. It was a world where a master had to be both a skilled artisan and a shrewd entrepreneur, constantly fighting to keep their head above water in a sea of rivals. Number 2. The masterpiece's impossible standards. The moment of truth for any aspiring medieval craftsman was the creation of their masterpiece, or chef d'oeuvre. This wasn't just a fancy term for a really good piece of work. It was the ultimate test, a non-negotiable hurdle that stood between a journeyman and the revered status of master. The requirements were often incredibly demanding, the materials costly, the time invested enormous, and the judgment of the existing masters could be merciless. Failure meant not just a delay in achieving master status, but often a crushing blow to one's aspirations, potentially ending a career before it truly began. Concept of the masterpiece emerged as guilds, became more formalized, and sought to control the quality of their members' work and limit the number of new masters. Early guilds might have accepted a simple demonstration of competence, but by the 14th century, the masterpiece had become a cornerstone of the system. Each guild had its own specific, often highly detailed, requirements for the masterpiece. These weren't vague instructions, they were precise demands designed to showcase every facet of a journeyman's skill. Consider a prospective master goldsmith in Paris, around 1340. According to the Livre des Métiers, a compilation of guild regulations, a goldsmith's masterpiece might require him to fashion a complex piece of jewelry, such as an intricate chalice or a highly detailed reliquary, often incorporating multiple techniques: filigree, granulation, enameling, stone setting, and engraving. The journeyman would likely be given a specific design or a set of components that had to be incorporated, leaving little room for error or deviation. Quality of the metal, its purity, and the precision of the work were all scrutinized. A single misplaced solder joint, a tiny flaw in the enamel, or a misaligned gemstone could lead to rejection. For a master tailor in London, the masterpiece might involve constructing a complete garment, perhaps a complex tunic or an elaborate gown, entirely from scratch, demonstrating proficiency in cutting the fabric economically, precise stitching, intricate embroidery, and perfect fit. The London Tailors Guild had a reputation for extreme exactitude. Records show that journeymen would be provided with a specific amount of fabric and thread and expected to produce a flawless garment within a strict time frame, sometimes just a few days. Any wasted fabric, any crooked seam, any imperfect buttonhole would be noted by the examining masters. Cost of materials for the masterpiece was almost always borne by the journeyman. This was a significant financial burden. For a goldsmith, the raw gold, silver, and precious stones required for a chalice could represent a substantial sum, possibly years of a journeyman's accumulated savings. For a weaver, the finest wool or silk for a complex tapestry was not cheap. Even for a less luxurious craft like baking, the journeyman might be expected to provide the highest quality flour, yeast, and other ingredients for a specific, often elaborate ceremonial bread or pastry that went beyond everyday loaves. This financial outlay meant that if the masterpiece failed, not only was the dream shattered, but a considerable investment was also lost. This added immense pressure to succeed. The time commitment was another grueling aspect. A masterpiece was not something that could be rushed. It demanded absolute focus and dedication. Depending on the craft and the complexity of the piece, it could take weeks, months, or even a full year to complete. During this period, the journeyman was typically not earning any money from other work, as their entire focus had to be on the masterpiece. They might rely on their accumulated savings or the support of their family, which put additional strain on already limited resources. The pressure of this financial drain, combined with the intense creative and technical demands, created a crucible of stress. The judgment process itself was a nerve-wracking ordeal. The completed masterpiece would be presented to a panel of existing masters, often the guild wardens or a specially appointed committee. These were the very individuals who had already achieved what the journeyman was striving for, and they guarded their exclusive status jealously. Their examination was meticulous and often severe. They inspected every detail, tested the durability, and questioned the journeymen on their methods and choices. There was no room for excuses or justifications. The piece either met the standards or it did not consider the atmosphere during such an examination. A journeyman would stand before a formidable group of older, experienced masters, their faces stern, their eyes critical. They would pass the piece around, turning it over, feeling its weight, tapping its surfaces. They might use magnifying glasses, specialized tools, or even scales to verify dimensions and weights. For a tailor, the garment might be tried on a dummy, or even on one of the masters, to check the fit and hang. For a baker, the bread might be cut open, its crumb examined, its aroma sniffed, and its texture tested. The silence in the room would be punctuated only by the occasional grunt or murmur of the masters, each one a potential harbinger of doom. The reasons for rejection could be numerous. Beyond obvious flaws in craftsmanship, a piece might be deemed too derivative, lacking originality, if originality was expected, or perhaps it didn't fully demonstrate the required range of techniques. Sometimes, rejection might even be arbitrary or influenced by personal grudges or the guild's desire to limit the number of new masters joining their ranks. If the guild deemed the number of masters sufficient, they might raise the bar even higher for new applicants, making the masterpiece an almost impossible feat. If the masterpiece was rejected, the consequences were dire. The journeyman would have to start over, often with a different piece, bearing the cost and time burden again. This could mean years of delay, further financial hardship, and the crushing weight of disappointment. Some might give up entirely, resigning themselves to remaining a journeyman or pursuing a different, less esteemed livelihood. For many, the masterpiece was the last, most formidable barrier before they could truly establish their own independence and legacy. Its impossible standards were not merely a test of skill, but a test of endurance, resilience, and unwavering dedication to their chosen craft. It was the ultimate gatekeeper, ensuring that only the truly exceptional or incredibly lucky made it through. Number 3. The perilous path of the journeyman. After surviving the long, often brutal years of apprenticeship, a young craftsman wasn't immediately granted the keys to his own workshop. Oh no, that was only the beginning of another grueling phase, the journeyman period. This was a time of wandering, working for different masters, and proving oneself worthy of future independence. It was a perilous, uncertain path, fraught with physical hardship, financial instability, and intense competition. This period was often referred to as the Wanderjahr, or years of wandering, and it was a critical yet incredibly challenging transition. Once an apprenticeship was formally completed, usually by an agreement between the master and the apprentice's parents, the newly minted journeyman was free in a sense, but also without a permanent place. They couldn't simply set up shock guild ordinances specifically forbade it. To become a master, a journeyman needed to gain more experience, often under a variety of masters, and sometimes in different towns or even countries. This was believed to broaden their skills, expose them to new techniques, and give them a wider understanding of their craft. The life of a medieval journeyman was defined by movement. They would pack their meager belongings, a change of clothes, a few essential tools, and maybe a small amount of money, and set out on foot. Travel in the Middle Ages was dangerous. Roads were often poorly maintained, infested with bandits, and susceptible to the whims of weather. Journeymen faced the constant threat of robbery, injury, or illness, far from any familiar support system. They might sleep rough in barns or in cheap, overcrowded inns, constantly exposed to the elements and disease. There was no public transport, no maps with clear routes, just the open road and the hope of finding a town with a guild in need of skilled hands. Upon arriving in a new town, the first task was to find work. This wasn't guaranteed. Guilds tightly controlled who could work within their jurisdiction. A journeyman would typically report to the local guild hall, present his letters of recommendation from his former master, and apply for employment. The guild would scrutinize his credentials and sometimes even test his skills on the spot. If the guild wardens deemed the town already had enough workers, Or if they suspected the journeyman was a foreign competitor trying to steal trade secrets, they might deny him work altogether, forcing him to move on. Even if accepted, the pay for a journeyman was generally low. While they were no longer unpaid like apprentices, their wages were often just enough to cover basic food and lodging. Savings were hard to come by, and remember, they would eventually need a significant sum for their masterpiece and master's fees. A journeyman might work for a master for a few months, or even a year or two, honing their craft, learning new techniques, and saving what little they could. But the expectation was often to keep moving, to experience different workshops and different ways of doing things. This constant movement meant a lack of stability and the inability to put down roots, form lasting relationships, or accumulate significant wealth. Lodging was another challenge. While some masters might provide room and board for their journeymen, it was often rudimentary and shared with other workers. Many journeymen had to find their own lodgings in crowded, unsanitary urban areas, further exposing them to disease and hardship. A common medieval saying, "He who has no money can take to the road," reflected the reality that for many becoming a journeyman was a necessity born of limited options and the need to earn a living while pursuing their craft. As more and more young men completed their apprenticeships, the pool of journeymen seeking work grew. Not every master had a vacancy, and the best positions, those with established masters who paid decent wages and taught advanced techniques, were highly sought after. Journeymen might compete for these spots through informal demonstrations of skill by boasting of their previous accomplishments, or even through networking with other journeymen who could put in a good word. The pressure to impress potential masters was constant. Moreover, the journeyman period was a time of continuous scrutiny. Even though they were no longer apprentices, their conduct and skill were still under observation. Any lapse in behavior, any shoddy work, or any insubordination could result in dismissal. A journeyman dismissed from a workshop might find it incredibly difficult to secure another position, especially if word of their poor performance spread through the guild networks. Letters of recommendation were crucial, and a journeyman without good references was essentially an outcast. For some crafts, the wanderjahr was an explicit requirement. In Germany particularly, the tradition of wandering for several years, usually 3 years and a day, was deeply entrenched, especially for trades like carpentry, masonry, and blacksmithing. These journeymen would literally carry a stens, a walking stick, and a cloth-bound bundle of belongings as they traversed the countryside, seeking work and new experiences. This period was not just about skill acquisition. It was also a rite of passage, a maturation process, where young men learned self-reliance and gained a broader perspective on the world. However, it also meant prolonged separation from family, home, and community, adding emotional hardship to the physical and financial struggles. The path to mastership was often long and uncertain. For some, the journeyman period could stretch on for many years, even decades. They might never accumulate enough savings to pay for their masterpiece, or they might simply never find a master willing to sponsor them, or they might struggle to meet the strict requirements of their guild's masterpiece examination. Many journeymen never actually became masters, remaining in that intermediate status for their entire working lives, forever working for someone else. These eternal journeymen were a common sight in medieval towns, highly skilled but forever tethered to the workshops of others, unable to achieve full independence or the prestigious status of master. Their perilous journey never truly ended, leaving them in a perpetual state of transit and dependence. Number 4. Brutal body-breaking labor. Long before anyone even thought about a masterpiece or the wanderjahr, the daily reality for apprentices and journeymen alike was relentless, back-breaking physical labor. Medieval workshops were not equipped with ergonomic tools or safety regulations. They were often cramped, poorly lit, and filled with hazards. The demands of the trade meant that workers, from the youngest apprentice to the most experienced journeyman, put in incredibly long hours, often from sunup to sundown, 6 days a week and sometimes even more. This brutal regimen took a severe toll on the human body, leading to chronic pain, deformities, injuries, and a significantly shortened lifespan. Imagine a typical medieval workshop. The light would often come from small leaded windows, or on darker days, flickering tallow candles or smoky oil lamps. Ventilation was poor, especially in trades that involved furnaces, dyeing vats, or noxious chemicals. The air was thick with dust from wood or stone, fibers from textiles, or fumes from metalworking and tanning. This environment was a constant assault on the lungs. Medieval records, while not explicit medical reports, often hint at the prevalence of consumption or phthisis, tuberculosis, respiratory ailments, and eye problems among craftsmen. The workday was dictated by the sun and the needs of the master. During summer, work might begin before dawn and continue until well after dusk, especially for trades with high demand or where a project needed to be finished quickly. Common schedule would be from 4 or 5 a.m. until 8 or 9 p.m., with perhaps a short break for meals. That's a 15 to 17-hour day, day after day, week after week. There were no weekends off as we know them, only Sundays and specific religious feast days, which might be limited depending on the guild's regulations or the urgency of the work. Specific crafts came with their own unique hazards. Consider the blacksmith. Constant pounding of hammers on hot metal, the roar of the forge, the flying sparks, and the immense heat would have been grueling. Blacksmiths often suffered from hearing loss, burns, eye injuries, and chronic joint pain from repetitive motions and heavy lifting. Their hands, though incredibly strong, would be calloused and scarred. The vibrations from hammering could lead to conditions like white finger, Raynaud's phenomenon, or nerve damage, which would make delicate work impossible in later life. A mason or stonecutter faced different but equally severe challenges. Constant chipping, carving, and lifting of heavy stone would lead to widespread injuries. Lung disease from inhaling stone dust was rampant. Back problems, hernias, shattered fingers from errant hammer blows, and cuts from sharp tools were commonplace. The need to work at height, often without proper scaffolding or safety nets, also meant a high risk of falls, leading to broken bones, or even death. Cathedral building, a monumental undertaking, was a graveyard for many masons. Tanners and dyers worked with incredibly foul and corrosive substances. Tanning involved soaking hides in vats of urine, animal dung, and lime, followed by solutions of bark. The stench was unbearable, and the chemicals caused skin irritations, burns, and chronic illnesses from prolonged exposure. Dyers often used mordants containing heavy metals like lead or arsenic, and natural dyes derived from plants, insects, or minerals, many of which were toxic. Handling hot vats of dye, constantly stirring and lifting wet fabric, meant a high risk of scalding and chemical burns. The exposure to these substances could lead to blindness, organ damage, and shortened lives. Even seemingly safer crafts were physically demanding. A weaver spent countless hours hunched over a loom, operating pedals with their feet and passing shuttles with their hands. This repetitive motion led to musculoskeletal problems, back pain, and eye strain from focusing on fine threads in dim light. Bakers dealt with the intense heat of ovens, the heavy lifting of sacks of flour, and the repetitive kneading of dough. They risked burns, respiratory issues from flour dust, and shoulder or wrist problems from continuous kneading. Tools themselves were often heavy and unwieldy, designed for durability rather than ergonomics. Apprentices, in particular, would start with the most basic, often heaviest tasks, such as hauling materials, grinding pigments, stoking fires, or operating bellows for hours on end. This was essential strength and stamina training, but it was also incredibly taxing on young, developing bodies. Children as young as 10 or 12 were engaged in this kind of labor, often developing deformities like bowed legs or twisted spines from improper posture, or carrying heavy loads. Injuries were a constant threat and a fact of life. A slip of a knife, a moment of inattention with a sharp chisel, a mishit with a hammer, any of these could result in losing a finger, a hand, or an eye. In a time before modern medicine, such injuries were often debilitating and could end a craftsman's career. A baker with a permanently burned hand, a weaver who lost an eye, or a carpenter with a crippled limb would struggle to find work and provide for themselves, highlighting the precariousness of their existence. There was no workers' compensation, no disability benefits, and no concept of occupational safety laws. Survival often depended on the charity of others or the goodwill of their master or guild, which was far from guaranteed. The pervasive exhaustion from such long hours and demanding labor also contributed to accidents. A tired mind is a less vigilant mind. Apprentices and journeymen, pushed to their limits, were more prone to making mistakes that could result in severe injury. The brutal physical demands were not just an inconvenience. They were a fundamental aspect of medieval craft production, shaping the lives and bodies of those who dared to pursue mastery. This relentless grind was a stark reminder that skill alone was not enough. Immense physical endurance and a willingness to endure pain were equally crucial for survival and advancement in the guild system. Number 5. A life without your own choices. Imagine a life where your family chose your career, where you couldn't marry without permission, where you couldn't leave town, or even save money for yourself for years on end. This was the reality for apprentices and, to a lesser extent, journeymen in medieval guilds. Personal freedom, as we understand it today, was a luxury that simply did not exist for those bound by guild ordinances. From the moment an apprenticeship contract was signed, a young person essentially became the property of their master, stripped of many fundamental rights and choices for a significant portion of their life. The apprenticeship contract, a legally binding document often sealed with oaths and overseen by civic authorities, was the foundation of this lack of freedom. Typically entered into by parents on behalf of their child, often as young as 10 or 12, it outlined the terms of service. The apprentice was obligated to serve their master faithfully for the entire agreed-upon term, which could range from 7 to 14 years, sometimes even longer, for highly specialized trades. During this time, the apprentice effectively lived under the master's roof, was fed and clothed by him, and was entirely subject to his authority. They could not leave the master's service without his explicit permission, nor could they be dismissed without just cause, often involving a hearing before guild elders. Breaking the contract unilaterally could result in severe penalties, including fines, imprisonment, or even branding. A master's authority over his apprentice was extensive, almost patriarchal. He was responsible for the apprentice's moral and spiritual upbringing. In addition to teaching the craft, this meant strict control over their daily lives. Apprentices had little to no personal time. Their days were filled with work, chores, and basic instruction. Leisure activities were heavily restricted, often limited to Sundays and feast days, and even then, under the watchful eye of the master or his family. They were forbidden from frequenting taverns, gambling houses, or engaging in disreputable behavior. These rules were not just about moral rectitude. They were about maintaining discipline, preventing distractions, and ensuring the apprentice's focus remained solely on their training. Financial independence was virtually non-existent. Apprentices were almost universally un-knied. Their compensation was the training they received, along with room, board, and sometimes a basic set of clothes. Any money they might somehow acquire through small tasks or gifts was usually managed by the master, who might hold it in trust until the end of the apprenticeship, or simply appropriate. This meant apprentices had no means to save for their future, to purchase personal items, or to exercise any financial choice. They were entirely dependent on their master's goodwill for even basic needs beyond the terms of the contract. The inability to marry was another significant restriction. Guild ordinances across Europe often explicitly forbade apprentices from marrying during their term of service. The rationale was simple. Marriage would divide their loyalty, introduce financial burdens, a family to support, and detract from their commitment to the craft. A married apprentice, particularly one with children, would be far less mobile, less willing to endure the hardships, and perhaps more likely to demand higher wages or leave service prematurely. This meant that young men and women in their late teens and early 20s, often at the peak of their physical and reproductive prime, were forced to defer their personal lives and dreams of a family until they achieved master status, which could be decades away. For women apprentices who were common in certain trades like weaving, brewing, or embroidery, the expectation was often that they would marry and cease formal guild work after completing their apprenticeship, unless they were widowed masters' wives who took over the family business. Even after completing an apprenticeship and becoming a journeyman, the shadow of restricted freedom lingered. While no longer bound to a single master in the same way, a journeyman's choices were still heavily dictated by guild regulations. They could not simply settle down and start their own business. They had to embark on the wanderjahr, moving from town to town, seeking work from established masters. This mobility was a requirement for gaining experience, but it also meant a lack of permanent home, community ties, or long-term stability. They were perpetual transients, subject to the whims of the market and the acceptance of local guilds. Guilds also controlled where their members could work and live. A master could only operate within the jurisdiction of his guild. Moving to another town or city meant applying for membership in the local guild, which often involved hefty fees, a new masterpiece, and the scrutiny of new masters. It was not uncommon for guilds to be hostile to foreign masters, making it incredibly difficult to relocate and establish a new business. This created a strong incentive to remain within one's home city and guild, limiting geographical freedom and economic opportunity. Furthermore, guild members, from apprentice to master, were subject to the moral and social dictates of the guild. Guilds were not just economic organizations, they were social and religious fraternities. They regulated members' conduct outside the workshop, punishing drunkenness, gambling, or any behavior that could bring disrepute to the craft. While this provided a sense of community and mutual support, it also meant a constant state of surveillance and judgment. A master who behaved unseemly might find himself fined, ostracized, or even expelled, losing his livelihood and standing. This social control meant that even masters, who had achieved the pinnacle of the system, were far from entirely free agents. Their choices in business, family, and personal life were always subject to the prevailing norms and the watchful eyes of their guild. It was a trade-off security and status in exchange for personal autonomy. Number 6. The wallet. Wrenching financial burden. Becoming a master in a medieval guild was not just about skill and endurance. It was a deeply expensive undertaking, a financial gauntlet that stretched for years, sometimes decades. From the initial apprenticeship fees to the final payment for master status, the aspiring craftsman faced a relentless series of payments, contributions, and expenses that could drain his savings and put his family into debt. This wallet-wrenching financial burden was a significant barrier to entry, ensuring that only those with some degree of family support or extraordinary luck and frugality could even dream of achieving mastership. The financial journey began right at the start of the apprenticeship. While many apprentices were unpaid, their parents or guardians often had to pay a substantial sum to the master as an indenture fee or premium. This fee compensated the master for the cost of feeding, lodging, and clothing the apprentice, and for the invaluable training he would impart. For a prestigious craft like goldsmithing or mercery, dealing in fine textiles, this fee could be exorbitant, equivalent to the annual income of a modest household. Records from various English guilds, such as the Worshipful Company of Mercers in London, show indenture fees ranging from a few shillings to several pounds, a princely sum in medieval currency. For families of modest means, securing such a sum often meant selling assets, taking out loans, or pooling resources from relatives. This immediate financial hurdle meant that many, particularly the poorest, were excluded from certain trades from the outset. During the apprenticeship, although the apprentice was unpaid, there were still incidental costs. While the master provided basic necessities, additional clothing, personal items, or small comforts would need to be purchased, often with money provided by the apprentice's family. Any damage to tools or materials might also be charged back to the family, adding to the financial strain. Upon completing the apprenticeship and becoming a journeyman, the immediate financial outlook improved slightly, as journeymen earned wages. However, these wages were typically low, designed to cover basic living expenses rather than allow for significant saving, and save they must. The journeyman period, with its emphasis on travel and working for various masters, meant constant expenses for lodging, food, and transport. Journeymen often had to purchase their own set of more advanced tools as they gained proficiency, which could be very costly, especially for specialized equipment in trades like clockmaking or instrument making. The finest chisels, planes, or a set of measuring instruments represented a significant investment. The greatest financial drain for a journeyman was undoubtedly the cost associated with the masterpiece itself. As discussed, the journeyman was almost always responsible for procuring the raw materials for their masterpiece. For a master cooper, the cost of the finest oak staves and iron hoops for a large wine barrel could be substantial. For a master painter, the price of rare pigments like ultramarine, made from lapis lazuli or cochineal, along with fine brushes and canvases, could be crippling. These were not materials to skimp on. The quality of the raw materials directly impacted the quality of the finished product, and thus the judgment of the masters. If the masterpiece failed, all that material cost was lost. Beyond the masterpiece, there were hefty master's fees or entrance fees required to formally join the guild as a master. These fees were often substantial, sometimes requiring a master to pay them in installments over several years. The purpose was twofold: to provide revenue for the guild's operations, maintaining the guild hall, supporting members in need, civic activities, and to act as a further barrier to entry, limiting the number of new masters. Records of the Brewers' Guild in London, for instance, show entrance fees that would be equivalent to several months of a skilled craftsman's wages. These fees were often higher for foreigners, those not born in the town or not having completed their apprenticeship within that specific guild's jurisdiction, a deliberate protectionist measure. On top of the fees, a new master was typically expected to host a lavish master's feast or entrance banquet for the existing masters and guild officials. This wasn't a small gathering. It was a demonstration of the new master's financial stability and generosity, and a way to cement his place within the guild's social fabric. The cost of food, drink, and entertainment for dozens of people could be immense, potentially wiping out any remaining savings the new master might have accumulated. It was a required social ritual, an unwritten rule that nonetheless carried immense weight. Refusing to host such a feast or doing it poorly could negatively impact a new master's standing and relationships within the guild. Once a master, the financial burdens did not cease. Masters were required to pay annual dues to the guild, contribute to various guild charities for sick or elderly members or widows of masters, and often participate in civic duties that incurred costs. They also had to finance the setup of their own workshop, which meant renting premises, purchasing a full set of tools, acquiring initial stock of raw materials, and potentially hiring their own apprentices and journeymen. This initial capital investment could be enormous. A master mason starting his own business would need to rent a yard for stone, purchase quarry stone, and acquire a full suite of mallets, chisels, measuring instruments, and lifting equipment. A master weaver would need to buy a loom, prepare warps, and stock various threads. Maintaining a workshop involved ongoing expenses, rent, fuel for heating or forges, lighting, and the constant replenishment of raw materials. Furthermore, masters had to manage their own finances, extending credit to customers, dealing with bad debts, and navigating the complexities of medieval commerce. They were small businessmen in an era with limited financial institutions and no easy credit. A single bad debt or a downturn in trade could easily lead to financial ruin, causing a master to lose his workshop, his status, and everything he had worked for. The financial journey to mastership was a tightrope walk over a chasm of debt and destitution, making it one of the most grueling and anxiety-inducing aspects of the entire process. Number 7. The iron grip of guild rules. From the moment an apprentice joined a guild until the day they died as a master, their lives were governed by an intricate, often suffocating web of rules and regulation. These weren't just guidelines. They were strict laws enforced with fines, physical punishment, and the ultimate threat of expulsion. The iron grip of guild ordinances extended far beyond just quality control, dictating nearly every aspect of a craftsman's professional and even personal life. This pervasive control ensured conformity, protected the guild's interests, but also stifled individual freedom and innovation. Guilds, in their essence, were medieval professional associations, but they functioned more like powerful self-governing mini-states within a town. They received royal charters or municipal recognition, granting them monopolies over specific trades within their jurisdiction. This power came with immense responsibility, which they exercised through meticulously detailed ordinances. For instance, the Livre des Métiers, compiled by Étienne Boileau for the city of Paris in the 13th century, meticulously details the regulations for over 100 different trades from bakers to scribes, underscoring the ubiquity and specificity of guild control. The most fundamental purpose of these rules was quality control. Guilds insisted on high standards of craftsmanship to protect the reputation of their trade and ensure fair dealings with the public. Ordinances specified the types of materials to be used, the methods of production, and the finished product's dimensions and weight. A master baker found selling underweight loaves might face a public shaming, a hefty fine, and the destruction of his faulty bread. A master tailor using inferior cloth would be similarly penalized. Guild wardens, elected from among the masters, conducted regular inspections of workshops, checking for adherence to these standards. They had the authority to confiscate goods that didn't meet muster, often destroying them in public as a deterrent. This constant scrutiny, while ensuring quality, was a source of persistent pressure for masters who had to be flawless in their production beyond quality. Guilds dictated economic practices. They set prices for goods and services to prevent unhealthy competition among masters that could drive prices down and devalue the craft. They regulated wages for journeymen and apprentices. They also controlled the number of apprentices a master could take on, and often the number of journeymen. This was a deliberate effort to manage the labor supply, prevent oversaturation of the market, and ensure that only a limited number of individuals could advance to master status. For example, the London Grocers Company had very strict rules about who could engage in the trade of spices and commodities, ensuring only their members benefited. Guild rules extended to the working hours. To ensure fair competition and prevent masters from gaining an unfair advantage, ordinances often specified the hours during which work could take place, typically from sunrise to sunset. Working by artificial light, such as candles or oil lamps, was often forbidden, especially for trades that involved precision, as it was believed to lead to inferior work. This meant that during winter months, workdays were significantly shorter, and during summer, they were incredibly long, all dictated by the guild, not the individual master or his workers. The strictures also governed social and moral conduct. Guilds often had deeply religious foundations, and their rules reflected this. Members were expected to attend religious services, contribute to the guild's patron saint's chapel, and participate in religious processions. Drunkenness, gambling, blasphemy, and other forms of immoral behavior were often explicitly forbidden, with fines or other punishments for transgressors. Apprentices and journeymen were particularly subject to these moral codes. A young apprentice found loitering in taverns or neglecting his duties might face a beating from his master with the guild's full approval. These rules aimed to uphold the guild's reputation and ensure a disciplined workforce. The process of becoming a master was entirely governed by guild rules. The requirements for the masterpiece, the fees, the probationary periods, and the criteria for judgment were all enshrined in the ordinances. Any deviation, any attempt to bypass the established path, would be met with swift and severe retribution. This bureaucratic rigidity, while ensuring a structured progression, often meant that talent and hard work alone were not enough. One had to navigate a complex labyrinth of procedures and satisfy the precise, sometimes arbitrary, demands of the existing masters. Inter-guild disputes and protectionism were another aspect of guild control. Guilds jealously guarded their monopolies. They fiercely resisted outsiders, whether craftsmen from other towns or ungilded artisans from practicing their trade within their jurisdiction. If a shoemaker from a neighboring village tried to sell his wares in a town controlled by a powerful shoemakers guild, his goods could be confiscated, and he could be expelled from the town. These rules could even lead to violent confrontations between rival guilds or between guilds and unlicensed workers, highlighting the fierce protectiveness of their economic territory. The penalties for breaking guild rules were not light. Fines were common, and they could be substantial, representing a significant portion of a craftsman's income. Confiscation of goods was also frequent. For more serious infractions, such as repeated poor-quality work selling forbidden goods or gross insubordination, physical punishment was a real possibility, especially for apprentices. Whipping or public humiliation was not uncommon. The ultimate punishment, however, was expulsion from the guild. This was a death sentence for a craftsman's career. Without guild membership, one could not legally practice their trade in town, sell their goods, or employ workers. It meant utter professional ruin, forcing the individual into low-wage informal labor or out of the town entirely. The iron grip of these rules, enforced by the very masters who benefited from them, was a constant, pervasive force, shaping every decision and action of a medieval craftsman, from the lowest apprentice to the most respected master. Number 8. The apprenticeship's endless grind. Before any talk of wandering journeyman years challenging masterpieces or the cutthroat world of master competition, there was the apprenticeship. This was the foundational, yet arguably most grueling, aspect of becoming a master. It was a period of endless grind, servitude, and often thankless labor, where a young boy, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, was handed over to a master for a term that could last a decade or even longer. For these formative years, the apprentice's life was not his own. It was entirely dedicated to the master, the workshop, and the laborious, slow acquisition of a craft. Imagine a boy, let's call him Thomas, arriving at the workshop of a master carpenter in medieval London around the year 1320. His parents, likely farmers or humble town dwellers, have paid a fee, signed a contract, and now Thomas is bound. He is no longer just Thomas. He is the master's apprentice, a bondservant in all but name. His term is 7 years, a common duration, but it feels like an eternity. His days begin before dawn and end long after dusk, a relentless cycle of physical exertion and rote learning. In the early days, Thomas's tasks are far from glamorous. He is the fetch and carry boy, the workshop's general laborer. He hauls water from the well, chops firewood, sweeps sawdust, empties chamber pots, and runs errands. He spends hours grinding pigments for paint, polishing tools, or stirring vats of dye. These tasks, though seemingly menial, are crucial. They teach him discipline, obedience, and the fundamental materials and processes of the trade. They also build his physical stamina, preparing him for the heavier work that will come later. For years, his hands will ache, his back will throb, and his body will constantly be tired. But he must not complain. The master's workshop is Thomas's entire world. He lives under the master's roof, often sleeping on a straw pallet in the corner of the workshop or a small attic room, sharing space with other apprentices or journeymen. His food is simple: gruel, coarse bread, perhaps some meager meat, or fish if the master is prosperous, and ale. Meals are eaten quickly, often standing or hunched over a workbench. There is no time for leisurely dining. His clothing is basic, usually provided by the master, and often patched and worn. Personal hygiene is rudimentary in medieval times, and a warm bath is a rare luxury. The instruction itself is largely hands-on, often brutal, and lacking in formal structure. There are no textbooks or organized lessons. Thomas learns by observing, imitating, and endless repetition. The master, or a senior journeyman, demonstrates a technique, and Thomas attempts to replicate it again and again. If he makes a mistake, he might receive a sharp rebuke, a cuff to the ear, or even a beating with a stick. Discipline is swift and firm, intended to instill obedience and eliminate errors. The master is not just a teacher. He is a surrogate father, and his authority is absolute. Thomas cannot contradict him, question his methods, or refuse a task. As Thomas grows older and more experienced, his tasks become more skilled. He might learn to prepare wood, cut basic joints, or sharpen tools correctly. He graduates from hauling timber to sawing it, from grinding pigments to mixing paints, from cleaning looms to threading them. Each new skill is taught incrementally, building upon the last, always with the emphasis on precision and efficiency. He learns the secrets of the trade, the special glues, the particular ways to season wood, the precise angles for cuts, knowledge that has been passed down through generations. This is the true value of the apprenticeship: access to guarded guild knowledge. The social life of an apprentice is virtually non-existent. There are no evenings out, no casual visits to friends or family. His social circle is limited to the master's household, fellow apprentices, and perhaps the occasional interaction with customers. Weekends, as we know them, do not exist, and holidays are few. Sundays are for church, and perhaps some rest, but often, even then, there are chores to be done. Marriage or romantic relationships are strictly forbidden for apprentices. Their loyalty and focus must remain solely on their craft. The endless grind also means constant exposure to the physical dangers and health hazards of the workshop. Often without protection, Thomas's hands will be scarred from cuts and splinters. His lungs will breathe in sawdust and fumes. His back will ache from heavy lifting and long hours hunched over a workbench. Accidents, such as losing a finger to a saw or being burned by hot pitch, are a constant threat. In a time before modern medicine, such injuries could be debilitating, even career-ending. The length of the apprenticeship also ties an apprentice to their master. If Thomas is unhappy, or if the master is cruel, he cannot simply leave. Contract is legally binding, and abandoning his service would mean a breach of contract, possibly leading to legal action, fines, or even imprisonment. His parents would also be implicated. Running away was an option, but it meant becoming a vagrant, an outcast with no prospects, unable to legally practice his trade. So Thomas endures, day after day, year after year, fueled by the distant hope of finally becoming a journeyman, and then, someday perhaps, a master free to forge his own path. The apprenticeship was not just a period of learning. It was a grueling test of patience, endurance, and unwavering commitment to a dream that was often far off and difficult to achieve.